we truly are doing that, and reclamation is taking the lead on that. And it is a very complex dynamic and not very well understood. Sites reservoir has been looked at a lot, and it has promise. I mean, all these reservoirs have promise for enhancing the water supply, but at what cost? I mean, a lot of it comes down to how much you can afford to pay to build a new reservoir. And another thing that's interesting is, what are the trade-offs in the system? When you set different requirements in the system, understanding these trade-offs are what these tools are designed to do. I mean, the suite of tools that I'm going to be presenting here are designed to evaluate the kinds of things the state board is looking at, setting different requirements, and what does that do to the system? What are the trade-offs? So some of the trade-offs that are key, I'm not going to go through all of these because I'd probably bore you, but water deliveries versus delta outflow is pretty obvious. And I have touched on delta flow requirements versus upstream environmental benefit. There's stream temperature versus springtime pulse flows, like Dave Vogel brought out with his proposal, is if you're going to increase spring pulse flows, what does that do to temperature and how do you balance those? And I'm going to touch on that a little bit more. Power versus springtime pulse flows. Species A versus species B, or salmon versus smelt. I think Chairman Hoppen, you brought up the tug of war between salmon and smelt requirements, flow versus that carryover storage, and that's something that if you change the flow requirements in the system, you're changing that balance. And understanding how you're changing all these balances is really important in trying to establish new requirements. Since 2006, we've had a lot of advancements in the tools. We're constantly improving the tools that we have available. And there's a new industry standard that's been developed, and it's something that we've been applying with project teams for a large number of projects, and CEQA and NEPA projects. We're doing this for DWR, for reclamation, for a variety of water districts, and we have presented some of this work to this board. I know you've seen these tools listed for the past day and a half, and you're probably tired of listening to modelers. And Kevin's probably going to hit me, but you probably want to hear more from lawyers at this point than you do modelers. But you know, it's important to recognize the suite of tools that you have available. And for some of the things that you need to evaluate, you don't want to use all these tools, but some of them are very important. So the question is, what do you need to use? What do you need to apply to answer the questions that you have at hand? And there's been a lot of different opinions on that. So I'm going to touch, I have touched on water operations, and I use calcium too, and I am familiar with these other tools if you have questions. You've heard about the economic models and hydrodynamic models, but how do these fit together, and how do people work together to get these tools to talk to each other is a really important component. One thing that folks haven't talked a lot about is common sense. You know, it's easier to build a model and use a model than it is to build and use common sense. And what we try to do is to use those models to build up our understanding and build up our common sense on what works and what doesn't work in the system. So through the tools that we have available, you can kind of build that. But these are tools to use to help you build your knowledge base and make decisions. So this flow chart, I think the state contractors presented a version of this flow chart, and you may have seen it before. But this flow chart is derived from a process of tools that are commonly applied. DWR and Reclamation, the Bureau of Reclamation, spent a lot of time through an effort known as common assumptions. And the common assumptions effort originally came about during the CalFed process to evaluate all these storage projects using the same tools. So these tools are now being applied to evaluate projects for CEQA NEPA. A lot of it originates from developing criteria, plugging that into a water operations model, determining differences in water operations. And those water operations affect hydropower, recreation, terrestrial habitat, economics, delta hydrodynamics, water temperature, and fisheries. What's really key here, and Jay Lund pointed this out, is that modeling and determining all these effects is a community effort. When we perform these analysis for SQL NEPA processes, it's not just that you're handing data from one model to another model, it's teams of experts. I mentioned that water operations, at least in our shop, we have 3 people to review it. I can run the hydropower model, but I can't interpret it, and I can't see what the ancillary impacts are. That has to go to a hydropower and power expert. So I can't just hand them the data. They need to understand where that came from and what it means. Same with recreation. There's recreational experts. So what if a boat ramp is out of business so many more times and a probabilistic? I can't tell you what that means significantly, but recreation experts can tell you that. Mark can tell you what changes in water supply mean to wildlife or waterfowl habitat. Delta hydrodynamics and water quality. I can tell you what the changes in flows are going into the delta, and I feel pretty confident in my results there, but I can't tell you what happens hydrodynamically in a delta. Folks like John DeGeorge at RMA can tell you that, and we work very closely together. Water temperature. I've run a lot of water temperature models, and I spent probably 2 years doing that, but I'm not a water temperature modeling expert. There's folks that's what they do full time, and we sit down with them with our model results and discuss what it means. What are these changes in flows? How do we do this? And then fishery experts, depending upon which fish species, there's different experts, and different information is important to them. And then economists are, there's different types of economists. There's ag economists, there's urban economists. So when you look at this flowchart of models, it's a flowchart of experts as well. And these tools have to be applied by the right experts, and they have to talk and understand the interaction of the models. And this is something we do on a regular basis for all of our environmental documents that we're associated with. And it's very time consuming. But I think Jay's right. The models that you see here aren't just the models. They're the data, the algorithms, and the people who are using it, the modelers and their expertise and how they relate and translate their results to other folks who depend on those results. And then all of us modelers, some of the more difficult part is to translate that to folks who have to make decisions, and in a way that you can understand it without us going into so much detail that it doesn't make sense. And that's another art in and of itself, and there's folks who are better at that than others. So these tools all here are available. The experts understand the limitations and assumptions. These models are documented. For example, calcium. A lot of folks say that they don't know what's in it. But it's actually fairly well documented, but the document isn't really well read. You have to study this stuff. It's like reading a textbook, a college textbook. It's complicated and it takes time to understand. The thing is that you could put all the documentation out there, but unless people can take the time and have the time to go through and understand it, you're never going to get there. So you have to rely on the experts to translate that for you. But these tools are available and they're working together, and I think that these results have been presented to the board. There's other tools out there, but you can start with this. Now looking at Dave Vogel's proposal on Springtime Pulse, I'm not going to read this, but he proposed the Springtime Pulse, and he's talked to me about how would you evaluate that? The trade-off between springtime flows and water temperature, and how do you manage that? So he's developed some criteria. We could plug that into calcium, whether it's a short time step or a long time step. We've worked with John Kane and done similar types of things, looking at pulses that are shorter time step than a month, and have worked that into the models, and we feel we can do that comfortably. Ron Milligan presented temperature profiles yesterday of Folsom. If you increase the flow from a reservoir during the springtime, you're taking cold water away. And what does that mean? What does that mean for fisheries later and the balance of the reservoir and the operation of the system? So we can plug that criteria in, look at the water operations, do temperature modeling, look at the fishery benefits and the fishery impacts. If we don't like that, we can revise the criteria and do it over again until we come to something that's a reasonable balance. Once we come up with a reasonable balance, then we can look at the other models for the other resource categories and determine what the effects are for the rest of the system. This type of procedure works when you're changing something in the delta that are best analyzed with hydrodynamics, like the Frank's Track project. For that project, the RMA folks are determining how to operate a 3-mile sluice gate, And then we're taking the results of that and going back and seeing what happens with water operations. And we're iterating to make sure we have the right effect to the system. And once we got that right effect, now we're going through and evaluating all the other resource categories. So depending on what question you're asking, you're going to iterate like this till you get to something. And these tools are available, and we're using them to do this. I'm going to briefly touch on the use of data and common sense. And I'm going to use an example that DWR presented yesterday, and Francis Chung presented about a year ago to the Water Board on the San Joaquin River flow and salinity proceeding. Unimpaired flow, the calculations are a conceptual quantity. They're calculated based on observed data, flow gauge correlations, extrapolations from other watersheds, computer models, and the methods for determining unimpaired flow has changed over time. As say a gauge is discontinued, you have to do something to fill in that gap. DWR calculates this for 23 different areas within the state using observed flow, storage data, evaporation, and gauge correlations. I'm going to touch just on one specific area, the Sacramento Valley. No relation to Naqua here, but the unimpaired flow for this particular area is something that I want to point out as an example because it's 6,400 square miles. It encompasses the unimpaired flow for the lower Sacramento River, the lower Feather River, lower Yuba River, and several other rivers. And it's determined based on the Dry Creek near Woodland, which is about a 100 square mile watershed, and the Bear River near Wheatland, which is about a 300 square mile watershed. And keep in mind that these relationships were developed in the late 50s and early 60s. So from 1922 to 1961, the unimpaired flow runoff from this basin is determined by 11 times the Dry Creek flow near Wheatland. And from 1962 to the present, it's determined by 2.18 times the estimated unimpaired flow in the Bear River. So when you look at the unimpaired flow indices that are used, that we're all using for evaluation, and folks are proposing to use for requirements, you've got to understand that there's some limitations to the data that we're using, and use common sense in applying those data. And I could spend probably an hour talking about the relationship between the Bear River unimpaired flow calculation and this whole basin, but it's just not a good representation of the basin when you're trying to use it to see what percent of unimpaired flow we're at, or to compare different hydrologic periods, or to compare it to historical data. So you just got to keep in mind of the data you have and how to use it. Dr. Latour touched on this with fish population data. You have to understand the data in order to use it properly. And that's one thing I want to say is a common sense of how do you apply this unimpaired flow data, what do you use it for? And I know DWR has touched on this a number of times in the past. So quantitative comparisons between unimpaired flow and observed data quite often leads to unintended results or inappropriate results, and you just got to be careful how we use the data. So my conclusion, and sorry for running a little bit over time here, there's a lot of tools available to use, readily available to use, that could be used immediately. If you had criteria to test, we have the tools in place to do it. And there's a suite of tools. You need qualified people to do it. It's an industry standard. We're doing this for quite a large number of projects right now, project team. And I think that's what you need to do when evaluating changes to the control plan, is look at the suite of tools that we have available.
Do you find in your experience, by the way, very good. Thank you. Do you find in your experience that the dialogue between state and federal agencies and modelers that are employed by water agencies and others is pretty good or okay, or, you know?
Oh, I think it's excellent.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm really impressed with the cooperation between the Bureau of Reclamation and DWR modelers. They work together quite often. If we get stuck on a problem, these models are complex, you have a suite of people you can call, and they're all very helpful. They're all very capable. I talk to other consultants quite a bit about the stuff we're doing. and the methods that we use for employing the models. So I think that the modeling community probably talks more than any other part of our community. And it doesn't just get it's not just limited to the consultants and DWR reclamation. I think there's a lot of other folks like Peter Vorster for the Bay Institute. We talk pretty openly about the application of the tools, and they're all good, honest discussions. QEMF is probably the best organization for facilitating those discussions. QEMF was originally organized to do this type of stuff, is to get the technical folks to talk and to share ideas and to understand how the advancements are happening so that we can do a better job answering questions.
But yesterday we also heard that there's not enough conversation between modelers, fish folk, and monitoring people. Do you agree?
I think in some forums that's absolutely true. In other forums and project teams, and I'll give an example of the Franks Track project, which I've been working on for a number of years for DWR and Reclamation. There's a very diverse project team, and I've spent countless hours talking to the smelt biologists, countless more hours talking to the salmon biologists. John DeGeorge probably got tired of me calling RMA, trying to figure out how these changes in delta salinity affects water operations. We spent a lot of time talking. Now when it comes to larger projects and forums and decisions, I think we do have room for improvement. Within project teams that I'm on, yes, it's there. But for processes, how do we change the water quality control plan and how will we determine effects when you've got so many different players and policy makers, I think we have room for improvement there.
Any other questions? Thank you. Good job.
Thank you.
We will resume at 1:30.
Couple curveballs in there. I know you will.